Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you all are. My name is David Orban, and I want to welcome you to Searching for the Question Live. We are streaming live on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube. On Facebook, both accounts, pages, and groups. It is the nature of our wonderful broken internet where interoperability is a dream, and we are all forced to go native and then try and navigate the complexity of collecting and connecting the various streams of communication. But wherever you watch, you're welcome to comment. And that is the beauty of being live. I will be able to pull in your comments and respond to your questions, take the direction of the conversations towards what you like, what you desire. We are also taking these conversations in offline or asynchronous rather than offline platforms. You're welcome to join our Discord server, where we continue discussing the themes that are covered in our episodes. And you can also suggest guests for the future and vote on the guests suggested by others. And if you like the content that together with my team I produce, you are very welcome to become a fan, a sponsor, a supporter, or a benefactor on Patreon at davidorban.com/Patreon or patreon.com/davidorban. All of those URLs work quite well. Today, the theme that we are going to discuss is augmented collective intelligence. And this is a very important theme, especially close to what I like to think about and also discuss, but also to try and practice with the help of, obviously, the machine intelligence that is supporting us in an ever more effective manner. And the guest that we are going to discuss it with is the Chief Innovation Officer of Genpact. He is part of the MIT Collective Intelligence Design Lab, and he most recently published the Augmented Collective Intelligence Report with a special focus on the future of work. So welcome, Gianni Giacomelli, to Searching for the Question Live.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
So let's discuss first, before we talk about the core of our conversation. How did you get to where you are now at MIT, at the C-level of a GE spinoff, publishing wonderful works? What was your trajectory in getting to where you are now?
Not quite sure, actually. I think that's the question my teenage daughters ask me all the time. But I think a lot of this is serendipity. You just bump into a bunch of things, and at some point you discover that there's something that you really like, and that is aligned with interest of large companies. And in this case, I used to work for other places, Boston Consulting, SAP, etc. And so I've gotten to the spin-off of General Electric that does a little bit of work that Accenture does. Genpact, and it was really at the intersection of global workforces and technology. Right, I've always had an interest in those things, and I think it kind of clicked. And I've been here for 10 years, which is it's a long time. I was in New York City for the longest time, and I just moved to Berlin, Germany, 6 weeks ago. MIT, I've been involved in the collective intelligence work of MIT for about 10 years. First as a sponsor, corporate sponsor. They did projects for me, and I always find that the collective intelligence angle is a fresh angle that goes a little bit away from the tried man versus machine kind of discussion. We had way too much of that, and the collective intelligence is actually a way of bringing together the two perspectives, right? And actually beyond that, the point of view of the network, not just individual people and machines, but really meshes of people and machines, which is a different design model. And so, working with the MIT folks, we found that we had a bunch of things in common. I found that it's a set of methods, and more than anything else, is a mindset and a worldview that is worth supporting, especially in a time that is divisive and as complicated as ours, in which people really fear anything related to machines. And that's where we are.
So we have Biagio saying hello from the beaches of Sicily. And yes, Biagio, we envy you, but thanks for following loyally nonetheless. Now, I always like to give context around the themes that we cover, also from a historical perspective. Is the concept of collective intelligence recent? Are there sources in ancient Greek texts? Did Plato or Aristotle deal with how wisdom emerges not only from the individual but groups?
So you're saying if it's been researched and scholars and focused on the intelligence of the collective as opposed to the intelligence of the individuals? Yeah, I mean, I think a number of organizational designers and sociologists have been looking at this for a long time. I'm not an expert in that. I think my focus is really more on the contemporary organizational design and what technology allows you to do. But I think if you think about it, there's a very strong social and even political undertone in the concept of, is the individual important or is the group important, right? So there's been actually ideologies that have been built on one or the two, right? And I think largely the modern capitalist environment and the economies that we live in, at least in the post-war, have been kind of emphasized the role of the individual, right? The role of the agency of the individual, the role of the individual leader. And I think you have plenty of literature around that. There's been quite a few people, especially of late, who've noted that individual leadership is only one of the leadership methods that could be used, and especially in a high information intensity environment like ours, you really can actually get a lot out of the work that many people do together, right? So yes, there's a rich historical background, but I think the fact that we have the technology that we have today completely changes the paradigm. Yeah.
And that is, of course, the difference between whatever absolutely admirable philosophizing ancient Greeks did, so much so that 2,000 or 3,000 years later, we still refer to them, and our ability to actually implement and experiment and verify whether those thoughts and of course ones that with equal merit came after are useful, and they can lead to better organizations, more efficiency, and further represent a platform for iterating and improving additionally. Now, the pace of change is accelerating. Actually, I published and formulated a paradigm last year talking about jolting technologies, where we are talking about an increasing rate of acceleration, where an exponential is not even enough to express the implications of and the impact of technologies. This is especially evident in artificial intelligence, and the glimpses of what we can do today have been potentially apparent, 20, 40, 60 years ago, but the ability to act hasn't been there. Anybody who would have imagined Wikipedia, even though thinking about it would have sounded absurd to the vast majority of people, including me probably, before knowing that it could exist, it could emerge. It was not only a dream, but it was also almost impossible to think of. So, what is the ability of your approach and your framework to be also predictive rather than retrospective and analytical? Can you apply it to future challenges as well? Do you think that it can be a leading indicator or a leading light of organizational design?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, Wikipedia is one of the few large-scale organizations that use systematically only collective intelligence to do what they're supposed to do. Again, an organizational model that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. We did not have the tools, but also people didn't think about it that way, right? They said, yeah, it's great. You have communities of people who write blogs and this and that, but you cannot do quality control. And obviously Wikipedia proved everybody wrong. And if you think about it, Wikipedia actually did it with very low technology, right? I mean, the hardly any advanced artificial intelligence has been applied to Wikipedia, especially in the first period. I mean, these days, increasingly, you have bots completing, stubs and whatnot on Wikipedia. But in the old time, it was just, collaboration environment.
But it is still proudly ugly.
It's I think it's a feature, not a bug, David. That's what they do. They say, hey. And to some extent, as some others if you look at Khan Academy, for example, mm-hmm. there's a beauty in the scrappiness of the thing, right? Because they focus on something else, right? It is very lightly edited, as in visually, but then that this is where the world's knowledge lives, right? And look, YouTube to a certain extent does the same, right? I think we've gotten used to a certain amount of roughness around the edges, and I think this is the method of production. Now, back to your question, and I certainly do believe that the use of collective intelligence as an organizational design mechanism is going to just accelerate going forward, and the reason for that is very simple. If Wikipedia could achieve what they achieved when they only had literally a little more than a workflow to work with, right? They hadn't really gotten much more than that. What is it going to be in the future when the corpus of knowledge that accumulates and is searchable grows non-linearly, right? Every year. If you think about it, the only engines that really mine that deeply are search engines that are connected to advertising revenue, if you think about it. But then you see the emergence of other things that are completely revolutionary. I don't know if you know what GDELT is, right? So the GDELT project was, and still is, an incredible effort in machine translating every source of published news in the world. So actually, I don't think it's every source, but it's 100 languages. And it's incredible. It's actually one place where you can find all news in any language, machine translated or in quasi real time, and you can use it for all sorts of things. Now, it's a repository, but then on top of that repository, typically you had only things like Google search or that kind of things. And increasingly, though, natural language processing allows you to actually get a lot more out of the enormous amount of content that is published. So many folks in your audience possibly have heard about GPT-3, right? So if you look at what happens with GPT-3 and you put it on top of GDELT, what is possible, right? Literally GDELT is, has been thrown at published media in a way that then makes it searchable. You can use all sorts of querying mechanisms. But GPT-3, which, by the way, is still full of bugs, and the hype is like an order of magnitude bigger compared to what it does, but it tells you that you can actually point this thing at a corpus, and this thing will actually start answering things in a way that is reflective of the corpus. So to me, one of the killer apps for this will be summarization, right? I mean, how do you summarize news about, let me just make it up, climate resiliency, architecture for climate resiliency in developing countries? Well, GPT-3 could actually give you an answer based on all the news that appear everywhere in the world. I mean, probably not today, but at some point it will tell you, look, if you need to reinforce the roof, there's maybe this guy from Indonesia who did this. It's actually not a query. What GPT-3 will do is will combine what comes from Mexico, Indonesia, some other place in India, etc., and will give you an answer of, you could do things this way, right? So now back to your point about organizational design of the future. Well, think of what that could do, right? Why do you need to have the organizational structure with typically hierarchical design that we have in large organizations, whereas you can actually farm out a lot of the knowledge intake to that corpus of knowledge and put an algorithm on top? I mean, it's like almost having low-level analysts who churn out work for you every day, right? And this is just one of the use cases that you could, but to me, is one of the most incredible ones, especially because, as I said, and as you talk about all the time, the corpus of knowledge is going to increase. Part of this is going to be created by humans, as in we all write blogs, we all have podcasts, videocasts, etc. And videocasts now can be transcribed, they can be searched. So all of this is not just video, it's not pixels to a machine. This is content, right? But then machines will continue to produce stuff, right? There's machines who create stock market reports and weather reports, and machines will continue to create. So the corpus is expanding non-linearly. The only thing that is preventing us from harnessing all of that is we don't have machines that make sense of natural language in a cogent way. But the moment we'll have them, and again with GPT-3 and a few of the natural language processing improvements of the last 2-3 years, you're not so far, right? So imagine the possibilities, right? And this is just one of the use cases.
One of the challenges is that the ability to actually perceive the rate of change is limited, even though the rate of change accumulates, and the implications and the impact of the applications by those who do have that perception enables further applications. And definitely we are at the point where we don't have time to educate the next generation to be comfortable with the tools and the organizational structures and the requirements to be productive part of a community or a company, an enterprise, under those new assumptions. There's just not, we don't have 20 years for the generation to grow up. Yeah. You mentioned GPT-3 and OpenAI that published, as of right now, just the API around GPT-3. Also because it is so large that even if they published the source code, in order to train the neural network, today you would need about $4 or $5 million in computing power. Yep. And it's not that it is not available to several corporations and organizations, but it is both expected that this cost will come down, as well as it is expected that whether in a year's time or 2 years' time or 6 months' time, GPT-4 with maybe $500 million of cost of training is going to be as much of an improvement on GPT-3 as it has been on the previous version. So assuming both, that human nature is unchanging, unless we talk about biological timescales, and the adaptability that we have is finite, what can an organization do except giving up? What is and it is somewhat poignant that you are associated with MIT, because universities and colleges are under great threat to prove that they both deserve the tuitions that they ask for, and that the whole concept of a 4-year college is still applicable to what we need to achieve.
Look, my view is there's space for both, but I'm going to give you a perspective. And by the way, I talk about it at length in the report that I published recently, which can be found at Supermind.design. There's a very interesting book that came out of a couple of years back that is called Learning by Doing by a professor at the University of Boston called James Besson. His point was that in all radical innovation waves, when some pace of technology inflects, the limiting factor of societies and economies to harness the new technology wave is not the luminaries, right? I mean, obviously you need those, right? You need the MIT professors, you need to have the super incredibly smart MIT PhDs or any other university. But really, the dominant limitation of the world in harnessing and harvesting that possibility is call them the rank and files, right? The people who are going into, so to take industrial revolution, people who are going in with the wrenches and are able to restructure the assembly line and continuously improve that assembly line by using now electrical motors as opposed to steam engines. And some of it is going to be done by, again, some high-level person who comes in and has a visionary design. But a lot of the percolating down of that knowledge and the use cases and the harnessing of the use cases really depends on more normal people, right? It depends on people who are able to again, apply some of the, again, we're talking about GPT-3, somebody will take the API and say, hey, I think I can use this to do this. Right,
is the book you are referring to this one by Richard Dufour or
no, James Besson at University of Boston? Besson, B-E-S, either N or M. Learning by Doing,
There you go. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really good book. Again, I think there's quite a lot in there, but the analysis is super powerful, and I think the analysis actually has an implication that is quite important for large organizations, which is you got to invest in reskilling and broad basing of the new knowledge. It doesn't matter if all your people are not going to be data scientists who actually know how to use Python properly, but it's important that a bunch of people know that you can actually take a JSON repository somewhere, and you can actually structure the data in a way that somebody can actually run a bunch of hypotheses and create a model, and then you can test the model. And that knowledge needs to be broad-based across an organization, because the moment you have that, then the functional people will be able to go to a subject, to a data scientist, for example, and say, try to do me this. The problem is always, David, information asymmetry. Right? There's people who have knowledge of the new stuff. You and I were talking about GPT-3 and GDELT, etc. Most people don't have any idea of that. And most people in companies actually have no idea of that. But the moment they have a smattering of understanding of the possibilities of those and also the limitations of those things, right? These are not, acts of God, right? I mean, these are machines that make mistakes, etc. But if you create that reskilling infrastructure that allows a broader base of people to know at least what the art of the possible is, then they will go and present to a subject matter expert who is really an expert in that very detailed field. Again, it can be anything from any artificial intelligence, analytics, robotics, or anything. But then they can connect. There's no information asymmetry anymore, right? I come to you, you have part of the answer, and I bring you a couple of ideas of what I had a hunch that could be done. That is what makes the difference in application.
So if you wish, this is a relatively simple trick that any organization can adopt just by realizing that allowing, if possible, imposing, if necessary, that a certain percentage of time of everybody must be dedicated to learning. And it is not the classical, training and certification and licensing requirements that many professions have, which is perceived as a necessary cost of being in the profession. But it is really the joy of serendipitous exploration of the interconnectedness of tools, challenges, unexpected questions, and their mutually reinforcing ability to support both the individual and the organization. And when this is implemented well, incredible things come up, like, for example, Gmail, which was the result of the free time of a Google engineer saying email sucks, I think I can do it better. And it was then and became one of the successful products of Google. Emiliano is asking whether it is true that CAPTCHA was used to train AI. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Originally, CAPTCHA was the merely squiggly writings that you can still find on Yahoo, for example, and some other sites that didn't realize that something better is available to stop you or stop bots from opening accounts. And whether the squiggly lines can be read by bots or not, sometimes they can. Or the Filipino or Indian people who are given the image of the CAPTCHA are fast enough to help the bots get in because they are reading it for them. But Luis Fonan, who created reCAPTCHA, realized that the challenge could have had the benefit of training AIs, and originally it was applied for digitizing books, so that the parts of the book that were not sufficiently clear could be supplemented by human intelligence, and the optical character recognition was complemented by human character recognition. These days, when you solve a CAPTCHA, and we can see immediately what we are talking about just by looking at the images. I would have thought, here you go. So when you see one of these images on a website that says, select all images with commercial lorries, you are absolutely training the AI because you are labeling something that the automatic recognition, the neural network, wasn't able to confidently say, yes, that is a commercial lorry. And the tasks are unlimited, and the benefit is huge, whether we are talking about self-driving cars, the ability to navigate better on maps, and also, of course, applied to many, many other tasks. So it is a great example of human-machine collaboration, exactly what we are talking about. Thank you, Emiliano, for the question.
David, if I may, your point about how do companies can implement, reskilling at scale, and your point about serendipity, I think you're right. I think part of it is culture, and part of it is, top down. This element of discovery needs to be part of the narrative of senior management, so that the culture embraces and rewards. Like Google, right? Your example of Gmail. One of the reasons why this happened, it just the incentives and the reward mechanism and the process were all point in a direction of just try. Most companies are not like that, and I would also say, though, most people working in companies, much of their time, they are not in the discovery mode. So I think there needs to be a balance between enabling the discovery, but as well as guiding individuals based on their profile and what they know towards a curriculum that kind of adapts to what they are, right? Because if the endpoint is common, the starting point is not common, right? Every person will have their own mix of skills, etc. And so what I've found, and by the way, on the Genpact side, I really have had the opportunity to work with our CHRO as in the head of HR to overhaul our learning and development, which is 90 almost 100,000 people. It's actually not easy to do it at scale, and we used collective intelligence methods to create communities of knowledge, right? So that there's a point that you were alluding to before, which is this knowledge that we're talking about is a lot more fleeting than the traditional knowledge, right? Traditional knowledge could be valuable for 10 years. Now, a lot of the things that you and I are talking about, we're talking about GPT-3. Next year at the same time, the thing will have moved on. I don't know if we have GPT-4, but certainly the boundaries of that thing have changed. So I think it's quite important to keep this thing fresh. And so communities of knowledge are actually much better than the typical top-down, hierarchical, I have a vendor selling me, documentation and training. So I think, those are some of the tips for large organizations. In our case, we have, again, 70,000 people every month going through the training mechanism. There's probably 600,000 hours of learning every month. And all of that is only possible because knowledge is fresh, but we also serve it up in a fairly personalized way to the individuals, right? To supplement their, let's say, their serendipity or their inner discovery motive.
The report that you published and which is freely available on Supermind.design is wonderful for many reasons. Thorough, accessible, also very clearly labeled as legally downloadable, shareable, transformable, translatable, remixable. You even allow commercial reuse of the transformed material. Apart from public domain, this is the most liberal licensing available. And possibly one of the reasons why you chose that is because you realize it is better for the ideas collected in this report to travel and to spread rather than being maximizing the short-term gain that an eventual monetization could bring.
Yeah, totally.
Now, the executive summary is 20 pages. The full report is almost 250 pages. So still quite daunting to absorb it all. Anything in an executive summary that is beyond one page already taxes the attention span of executives. Now, how can what are the highlights? And this is not a workbook. It's not a set of exercises that someone checks off and at the end they are done, right? At the same time, you want to be able to measure the results of some organizations that are adopting it. So how do you bridge the framework with practical implementation and measurable feedbacks?
So it's a great point. By the way, I think the executive summary is 1 page, but the overview is 20 pages. So
Oh, okay, very good. So I was right, and you know it.
Still 1 page somewhere.
One page
Yeah,
was necessary.
I have the same ADD problem as every other executive, but the answer to your question is I try to do 2 things. And by the way, I was motivated by the fact that there's quite a lot of literature around this, but I hadn't really found anybody who brought together many of the things that we know, right, in a way that can be applied in companies outside of academia, right? And so what I try to do is, let's talk about the concept first, right? The concept of, your choice is no more between a hierarchical design or some robots that take over some predefined workflow, but it's really about how do you harness the power of a network of individuals and then machines that can really help those individuals become more effective, right? And so the idea is this, right? How do you create an organization by doing 4 things, right? And this is actually specifically what we want AI to do: connect people and ideas, curate information so that those nodes can actually absorb that, help people and nodes collaborate, like you and I, right? I mean, we are now, we got together because of virtual means. We never met at any physical event, and there's a bunch of people are watching this, and this is completely, by the way, there's a bunch of AI in making sure that the quality of voice and video is perfect, and bandwidth, etc. And then help people collaborate. Again, this is where ideas need to commingle and cross-pollinate and etc. AI can help a lot with that too, right? If you look at Slack and Microsoft Teams and the future of those things, which will be very heavily natural language processing based. And then compute, right? Any other very heavy duty prediction that machines need to do, right? A machine can predict if I am supposed to meet with 2 or 3 people on LinkedIn based on network analysis that an artificial intelligence thing will do. So this is the application of AI. But I think what's even more important, I think, in the book is, apart from the concept, is, if you're a manager and a leader who really want to use, a collective intelligence organizational model, you really want to think about structuring things. Again, that's exactly where it is, right? So if you look at, there are 4 steps that people need to do, and I talked about Reskilling a moment ago, but you can use the same for a variety of things: your innovation groups, your marketing groups, your salespeople, your solution architects, anything. So first of all, in a network, there's no boxes and lines. It's a network, right? So you need to enable the nodes who need to be connected to each other to kind of discover each other. So suppose that I'm a consulting firm and I have a big client tomorrow that I need to meet, and the client wants to talk about artificial intelligence, and the client is a retail client. Well, if I'm a consultant who's serving the client, I need to go and find the retail person, the artificial intelligence person, bring them together. If it is a large organization, how do I do that, right? So again, very powerful role of making sure that the nodes in your network can talk to each other, right? Can see each other, right? Can find each other easily. The second element is energize those connections. Right? Like in the brain, the brain actually the cells in the brain to talk to each other, also because there are things called hormones, right? Hormones express certain parts of the brain in certain moments, and that creates a certain amount of energy. I think the analogy carries. In organizations, as you very well know, depending on the culture, people will talk or not talk to other people, right? They will talk to their organization, but not that organization. And so there are plethora of incentives, both intrinsic and extrinsic, that need to be put in place so that the energy of the connectivity expresses itself. Many organizations actually inadvertently dissuade people from connecting to each other, right? So the third element is the feeding, right? So there needs to be an institutional effort to provide outside-in external breeding to groups within the organization, and avoid that groups within the organization insulate themselves. I mean, the problem with silos, right? Birds of a feather, flock together. The problem is that there's something, it's something called homophily, which is, two people who are the same, they tend to actually bond together more than two people who are not the same. By the way, we have big problems with diversity and inclusion because of that reason. So those feeders need to actually force new thinking into groups, so that those groups never have the opportunity to actually insulate themselves, right? Anti-vaxxers or flat earthers or that kind of stuff. If there's enough feeding of contextualized and believable, credible knowledge, it will take problems away. And the last one is the wiring. Again, collaboration methods, collaboration platforms, design thinking. Everybody's been talking about it for the last 5 years. One of the reasons why design thinking is there is because it allows people who are very different from each other to come together and maybe create new products, create new services, create new concepts. It's actually a way of bringing people together. And one of the reasons, by the way, that Slack is important in a bunch of those collaboration platforms. If you look at Microsoft, the latest product of Microsoft, and the one they're really betting the farm on, is Microsoft Teams, and it's a collaboration platform. So I think as a leader, right, as a CEO, you want to do something that ignites collective intelligence. Those 4 macro areas with a bunch of work packages and work streams behind them are the kind of things that you got to think about. This is the inception of the strategy, and obviously the report goes into the gory detail of how you do it, the technologies that can do it, and a bunch of examples and case studies.
I am so glad that the 4 words, the initials of the 4 words, do not form a punchy acronym. If they did, I wouldn't trust you.
Yeah. No, I didn't even try. I try to actually mean what I say as opposed to make it sound chewable.
The marketing driven design of certain business school fare is depressing. So thank you for keeping your standards high.
Yeah.
Now, one of the natural consequences of the acceleration of change, or the increasing rate of acceleration in certain fields, is that if there were a central thinking inspiring or even imposing the actions needed in order to find solutions to challenges, solutions made possible by the technologies, challenges created by the same technologies as they disrupt existing processes, the probability that the centrally decided solutions would be the right ones is trending to zero, correspondingly with the speed of change. And as a consequence, the centralized peripheries and the nodes of the network at the edges are necessary in order to conduct independent experiments that can be observed in their own merit, and then they implement a natural evolution that will generate what is worth adopting all across. And this is something that is being understood better and better, unless you are a central banker, unless you are a regulator in a nation state, unless you need to approve certain drugs being available in the market. So, given the paradoxical nature of avoiding both the myopic laziness of fanatical libertarian positions that will be happily adopting the local maxima that any market-driven solution will find, and it will stop searching for anything else. On one hand, and avoiding the suicidal the suicidal position of the centrally controlled strategies that will say, this is our 5-year plan, we stick to it because the Politburo decided it, or whatever central committee. How can we mitigate the impossible task that a policymaker and a regulator have of giving answers to an unknown field? How can they understand what the consequences of self-driving cars or synthetic meat or personalized health or cryptocurrencies are going to be while nobody else does, and not extinguish the passion for innovation that should be intrinsically supported, helping competition, helping new business models, helping 1,000 of these necessary experiments flourish?
Wow, that's a question right there. You realize that that's a big book in itself. The perspective that I bring to that is the following. First of all, Exponential is very rarely centralized or fully centralized. In order for you to generate an exponential system, the boundary, the architectural boundary of a centralized architecture, it limits. You end up not having the ability to do that. So you need to, back to your point about natural experiments, etc. It's super important to use natural experiments. I mean, if you look at the system par excellence, which is the natural system around you, that thing without any central control mechanism, just a storing of knowledge mechanism that is called DNA, and the mutation, over billions of years has created everything we have around us, right? So natural experiments actually work, right? They work at scale, and they go exponential. I mean, you see around us. Now, I think part of the problem is, our institutions were built and designed in times in which we didn't have all of the stuff that we have now. There were times of low information intensity. Were times in which, I came from the US a few months ago, and I love working and living in the US, but, founding fathers, this is not the time anymore, right? I mean, we have, in theory, we all know, for example, that political institutions are always playing cat and mice, and they typically are the mice with new development of technology, right? Because they don't have enough of the right people to understand the implications of those new technologies and translate them into social policy. But in theory, they could actually avail themselves of, I would wager that by a bunch of people out there would be helpful to, you know how it works, right? I mean, you create a committee, and then a committee studies something, there's a few experts, and then, they work on this for 6 months and then drop it on policies, help, and this thing is just old, right? I mean, you could have done it 50 years ago. Whereas in theory, look, you could get a bunch of volunteers, you can get, natural language processing, GPT-3 in the next version. And then you say, well, within a couple of days, I can actually give you the implications of this on this very specific problem. So I think government forms need to evolve to a high speed information era. At the same time, I think the problem with markets and just completely, decentralized thing is the implications of some of these things have externalities that the laws and even the understanding of certain people cannot prevent from going into the wrong place, right? I mean, a bunch of things that we can do creates a lot of problems for a lot of people, and we, as the creators of those new technologies, of the methods, we don't pay for any of the displacement, and it can go somewhere else. I mean, for many years we had pollution problems and were never paid for. Cancer for cigarettes. I mean, there's a bunch of things that the market doesn't really solve, because the market really doesn't understand externalities, except if there's a law. But laws are very slow, and they're very, they're slow in many respects. So that's the problem with the market mechanism, right? So I think you need to have both, and to me, both of them need to collaborate with each other at the speed of the collective intelligence technologies that we have today, as opposed to some days you watch the hearings in Congress of 4 of the biggest CEOs of the most coveted technology companies in the world, and you're saying, is that really how the public and the private sector should actually collaborate and communicate? It kind of felt more like a circus than an actual exchange of information, right? So to me, but hey, we've been doing that for 200 years. What can go wrong? Well, what can go wrong is that the speed of change today, to your earlier point, is such that every time you do one of those, the ball was already moved, the puck has already moved 3 miles ahead, right? So always going to be slow in. And so I think it's a big problem, but right now I would actually look at the political institutions and the regulators and say, you got to up your ante in terms of really embrace the ability to make sense of the world through the technologies that we have, and control things differently.
And some people who are active in fields that are accelerating or jolting have the level of introspection necessary to make some design decisions that can have far-reaching implications. For example, many people kind of laughed or smirked when the for-profit fund that OpenAI established capped the return on the investment to its limited partners to not more than 100 times the capital invested. Mm-hmm. And that is laughable because the industry average or the industry threshold above which the return of a limited partner is deemed to be good, and then you can go back to them and say, hey, let's do it again, let's do a new fund, is 3 times the capital invested over 10 years. So to say, oh, I don't want to be too greedy, so I'm not going to be paying you back more than 100 times the investment is really totally out of this world. But that's kind of the point. They have the perception and the chutzpah to communicate that perception to the outside world that does not share that this could be really different. That the ability of an AI-driven fund of the kind of AI that they are designing, if not closely guarded, could run amok, could as they say it, capture the entire wealth of the available light cone of the universe, and they want to prevent that. So the ability to perceive and to communicate ideas and consequences that are inconceivable by most is a key component in order to start grasping the consequences of these structures. And hopefully your report is also part of that, because our ability to use the tools that we already have available is going to generate the next generation of tools, and the organizations that are good at that will acquire substantial and sustainable competitive advantage against the others that stick to the old methods of technologies and organizations.
I agree. I think, frankly, between you and I think technology and the tools is already like 2 years ahead of the methods and the practices. So, the part of, the long pole of the tent is, can we get people to embrace things? Again, back to the James Besson book. Do you have people with the wrenches in their hand who know how to place electric motors? The motors are there, right? I don't think that the problem is that. Obviously GPT-3 will get better, etc. At some point, maybe it's plug and play, but there's quite a lot that you can do with what exists today, right?
Now, one consequence, and this is my last question, even though I would love to keep the conversation going. Maybe you will have the chance of coming back, and I would love to invite you back. But the last question is, if we are evolving and co-evolving with our machines, with AI and networks, and your domain hints at that as well. I don't know how consciously you chose the design TLD, top level domain part of it. It is also the case that the rules of evolution itself change. Biological evolution was and is completely blind. The evolution of society could achieve only certain things when we were disconnected. Now, we must take advantage of what is possible in order to adopt new types of evolutionary components, both because we are connected and the emergent properties of the network are available to us. We see them, we can see them if we want to, and because even those who opposed it most ferociously, like, for example, Microsoft, realize how open collaboration and open source practices are superior. And they demonstrated it with the acquisition of GitHub, the largest repository of code. And now I'm sure they are unleashing all kinds of AI bots to analyze why certain projects succeed, other projects fail, and so on. So as we design the Supermind, what are, in your opinion, the most important emergent features and the most novel and powerful rules of this new layer of evolution that we can and should take advantage of?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I go into some detail in the report, but the idea is, if a blind system can actually create us an incredible amount of intelligence, and stored in DNA, some people made calculations. A few kilos of DNA can actually store all the knowledge in the world, just because it's so efficient at storing knowledge. So you imagine the amount of storage that is out there, and the permutations that the world has gone through. So imagine now that you have that plus some level of design, right? That's the reason why Supermind Design. So the organic component is super powerful. To me, though, the design here is like system dynamics design, as opposed to engineering design, meaning that in a system, in a network, in a system dynamic framework, you only design the high leverage points. You don't design everything. It's like being a gardener, right? You plant seeds, you prune, you water, things happen, right? Very different than building a house. Building a house has a blueprint, you cement, you put the wiring, etc. So, but it's still design, right? You still have a gardener, and some gardeners are really good. But the beauty of gardening is that the amount of information that is stored in your garden is like many, many orders of magnitude bigger than the amount of information stored in a building, right? Because nature, if you look into it, there's a lot of stuff that is happening there. So the idea there is, can I get organic growth of ideas, and by just designing the high leverage points, can I get to a higher level of intelligence? Because I think at some point our own human intelligence will just fail to keep track of what could be done. And instead, the idea here is to unleash the power of a network intelligence by just leveraging of and guiding a few of the points, as we said, the incentives, the ability of nodes to connect each other, the collaboration platform. But then you don't go and look into everything every time, right? You just let the network flow. That in itself should be an emergent hyperintelligence, right? You need to create the foundation, but then the rest might actually be a superior level of intelligence that, we kind of probably into it, but we wouldn't be able to blueprint, right? What we can do is play system dynamics, right? And hope that it flies.
Gianni, this was wonderful. Thank you very much. I am looking forward to learn how many organizations embrace the lessons and the inspiration of your report that is once again available to be downloaded for free on supermind.design. And I wish great success with further analysis, further publications, further applications, and I hope you will be able to come back.
Thanks a lot, David. Thanks a lot for asking me in.
So thank you all for being on and following Searching for the Question live. Thank you, Yuri, for being here. Emiliano says it was an amazing episode. You always drive us in beautiful places of our mind. And obviously, I do that thanks to our guests. So please make sure that you suggest great guests in the future as well, and vote on the suggestions of others, that you join the community at davidorban.com/discord to keep conversing. I also have an Italian language YouTube channel, and on davidorban.com/YouTube Italiano, you can subscribe to that too. And on patreon.com/davidorban, if you choose so, you can become a fan, a sponsor, a supporter, or a benefactor of Searching for the Question live. Thank you very much, and see you at the next episode.